Aisling was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and for it to be robbed so needlessly and so cruelly really sparked something in people.
A young woman who had just gone out in the middle of the afternoon to go do some exercise.
When any one of our sisters or our daughters, it genuinely could have happened to anybody.
As the investigation into her death continues, it's also understood that a new person of interest has emerged in the case.
He said, "I did it, I murdered, I am the murderer."
No remorse, no empathy. Thought he could get off with murder.
Aisling left work a little after 2:30 on the afternoon of the 12th of January. She got into a red Seat car, it was parked outside the school, and she headed for Tullamore. It was a nice, dry, crisp, bright, sunny day, and she decided to go for a bit of exercise along the Grand Canal.
And she drove from Durrow towards Dangan Car Park, which is a car park along the stretch of the Grand Canal, and she was spotted on CCTV footage along that route. And it was around 10 to 3 that she arrived at that car park. She pulled up in her car, got out of the vehicle, and she was wearing a pink bobble woolen hat. She was wearing a camogie tracksuit top, pair of leggings, a pair of runners.
And her Fitbit timed the start of her walk at 14:51, and she started to walk in an eastward direction along the Grand Canal.
She was on her own. She went down as far as Digby Bridge, and we know that because she did meet people there. And then she came back on herself and was heading back towards the car park.
The data from her Fitbit shows her walking 1 kilometre, 2 kilometres, and by 3:20 she'd walked 3 kilometres. Then at 3:21, the data on the Fitbit goes haywire. Everything becomes erratic and volatile, and Aisling's heart rate begins to decrease. It was 120 when she was walking along the canal. It went down to 100, 80, 60, and by 3:31, there was no heartbeat at all. Aisling was killed around about 3:30, and the very first call about the murder came into Tullamore Garda station just 5 minutes later.
Obviously, Gardaí were immediately on the scene. A 3-car convoy was sent out. Their efforts were made to resuscitate Aisling at the scene, but sadly, she didn't make it.
At the time of her death, Aisling Murphy, she was 23 years old. She had recently graduated as a primary school teacher from Mary Immaculate College in Limerick, and she started working in Durrow National School in March 2021, around 9 months before her death. She was described by many, including I think the principal of the school, as a real inspirational teacher. She was someone who was loved by all her first-class pupils.
Her whole family was really steeped in traditional music. They performed at FLAS and at music festivals right across the country. She had a deep love for traditional music. She was a very talented and very accomplished traditional musician. She played the fiddle. That was her instrument of choice. She performed, she competed, and she also passed her skills on to the younger generation. And she also loved GAA. She was very athletic, she was very sporty. Teachers who taught her when she was young described her as fearless when she took to the sports field. She loved camogie in particular. She played for her local club, Kilcormac Killahy. She just seemed like a really down-to-earth, genuine person. I think like so many people around the country after she died really resonated with Aisling Murphy, because we all know an Aisling Murphy. She's a sister, she's a girlfriend, she's a cousin, she's a friend, and she was all of those things to so many people. She was 23 years of age, so young, her whole life ahead of her, but you did really get the sense that she had already touched many lives, and even after she had passed away, she touched even more.
We know on the Friday after she died, there was a vigil held in Tullamore, and hundreds of people turned out that evening. And I remember seeing the pictures of her family, very poignant scenes of them walking along the stretch of the Grand Canal, kind of retracing Aisling's last steps, all the while that the crime scene tent was still up at that point.
That grief rippled out from Tullamore. It spread across the country. Indeed, it spread to many parts of the world. There were vigils for Aisling in America, in the UK, in Australia, in Canada. A hashtag was born. She was just going for a run.
After it emerged that Aisling Murphy had been killed along the banks of the Grand Canal in Tullamore, there was a huge outpouring of grief, not just in Tullamore and back in her own native part of County Offaly. You know, thousands of people in Ireland and right across the world were united in mourning the death of Aisling Murphy.
I think the reaction was just one of absolute shock, horror, anger. I think people just really could not believe that this could happen to a young woman. Seemingly, it was known at the time, a random attack. A young woman who had just gone out in the middle of the afternoon to go do some exercise. And in a town like Tullamore, which would have been a very tight-knit community, and I think people were just horrified at the horrendous nature of Aisling's death.
Aisling was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and for it to be robbed so seemingly thoughtlessly, needlessly and so cruelly really sparked something in people. I think everyone imagined Aisling, she could be their friend, their daughter. People could really relate to Aisling.
You know, people everywhere were thinking this could have happened to anyone's daughter, anyone's sister, anyone's brother. Young women were thinking, you know, this could have been me, and a lot of them could have been thinking I could have been in that scenario, and loads of people would have gone out for a run on any given day and think, you know, it could have ended like this.
To think that something like this could happen to a young woman in Ireland was bad enough, but to think that it could happen, you know, at the hands of a complete stranger, while this young woman was out exercising in the middle of the day, it really terrified people. And also, you know, in the immediate aftermath, there was a fear out there that there was a killer on the loose.
Gardaí immediately launched a murder investigation, and a crime scene was designated along the stretch of the Grand Canal where Aisling's body was found in the ditch. It would have been sealed off. The Garda Technical Bureau would have carried out forensic examinations of that scene in the immediate aftermath of the fatal assault.
We've established an incident room at Tullamore Garda Station with a team of over 50 Gardaí assigned to the investigation. Personnel from the National Specialist Units, including the National Bureau of Criminal Investigation, have been assigned to the investigation. No stone will be left unturned in bringing this perpetrator of this crime to justice.
The incident room down in Tullamore was a hive of activity. It was all hands on deck. The investigation to Aisling's murder was in full flow. Gardaí from right across the region were being drafted in. Between 500 and 1,000 jobs were dished out to various members of An Garda Síochána of that investigation team.
Drew Harris has assured the public, saying that there is a national effort behind this investigation in terms of resources. Gardaí from the water unit searching the canal there for any evidence of value, and also local Gardaí combing every inch of that area between Boland's Lock and Digby Bridge for any evidence.
Gardaí also wanted to use the media as best they could to try and get information out there and to appeal for information from the public. And part of that was that they issued a photograph of the bicycle that was found close to Aisling's body.
A key part of the investigation, that Falcon Storm bike with distinctive markings and those green fork fronts, as I said, a key element of this investigation.
They wanted to speak to anyone who saw this bike in the vicinity of Tullamore on the day of Aisling's death.
The guards put out a call for anyone who'd seen that bike. They also had a pretty good description of the man in the ditch with Aisling. That was from 2 eyewitnesses who were running by at the time.
The speed at which this investigation unfolded was particularly fast.
Within hours of Aisling's body being found, an arrest was made. And this happened on the back of the description.
By that evening, the guards had a suspect in custody whom they held for 24 hours.
He told Gardaí what his alibi was, and Gardaí continued with their investigations, and a big part of that was DNA testing. So at her post-mortem, the pathologist had taken samples from underneath Aisling's fingernails, and those samples were analysed. Gardaí compared that DNA sample to the man that they had arrested, and they found that he wasn't a match. And that was a big setback for the investigation, because that really showed that the person they had arrested was not the person who was responsible.
He had nothing to do with what happened to Aisling. He was completely excluded from their inquiries. And with him released from Garda custody, the stark reality was that her killer was still on the loose.
Yesterday it was a case of people waking up, and it was shock and sadness. Today it's a case of people waking up, and it's fear that the perpetrator, who people would have thought that was apprehended, is now at large in the community.
Gardaí are doing everything they possibly can and to find the person responsible for this and to bring that person to justice.
Gardaí were under immense pressure to find the person responsible for the death of Aisling.
As the investigation into her death continues, it's also understood that a new person of interest has emerged in the case.
Gardaí in Blanchardstown became aware that a man had presented at St James's Hospital in Dublin. This man was claiming that he had been stabbed in Blanchardstown, so a number of Gardaí went to St James's Hospital to speak to him. This was Jozef Puska.
Major development in the investigation into the murder of Aisling Murphy. Gardaí here in Tullamore have a new person of interest in their sights. It's understood that he is under surveillance in a hospital.
The morning after Aisling Murphy was murdered, Gardaí in Dublin received information a man had presented at St James's Hospital in Dublin with apparent stab wounds.
Gardaí from Blanchardstown, when they hear that this person has allegedly been stabbed in Blanchardstown the previous day, they come to speak to him, to ask him, get details, find out what exactly happened.
2 Gardaí were dispatched from Blanchardstown to interview him about the incident, and at that stage they believed he was a victim of a crime. So the Gardaí went into the A&E department of St James's Hospital and they spoke with Jozef Puska.
And during the course of that conversation, which took place with an interpreter on loudspeaker, Jozef Puska, obviously being from Slovakia, didn't have great English. And through the course of that conversation, Mr. Puska claimed that he had travelled up from Tullamore the day before.
He claimed that he got a lift to Dublin as far as Euston Station, and from Euston Station he said that he got a taxi to Blanchardstown.
When he got out of the taxi, he claimed that he was set upon by 2 men that he didn't know, and he had very limited descriptions of his 2 alleged attackers. He claimed one of them knocked him to the ground, and he claimed the other one stabbed him. And he said he doesn't know how, but he managed to make it back to his father's apartment in Crumlin. Gardaí then started to, I suppose, ask a few more detailed questions about him. He didn't have an awful lot of detail in relation to this alleged attack, so they started to make further inquiries.
But really, Gardaí felt that there were holes in this story, and they were also looking at the other injuries on Jozef Puška's hands and all over his forehead and face, and these what were described as dark red marks.
They felt that what he was telling them didn't add up. The one detail that did stick out to them was that he said on that day he had travelled to Dublin from Tullamore, and that struck a chord with them because they knew of what had happened in Tullamore. It had been heavily publicised, and so Gardaí from Blanchardstown contacted their colleagues in Tullamore and said, look, there's somebody here maybe you should speak to.
So Detective Sergeant Brian Jennings was one of the officers who was tasked to go to St James's Hospital from Tullamore to speak to Jozef Puška. And effectively what he said is he wanted an account from Mr Puška of what his movements were on January 12th, 2022, the day of Aisling's murder. The detective and his colleague went to St James's Hospital on the evening of January 13th. Mr Puška, they were informed, was in theatre, or he had recently been in theatre, and he was in a recovery ward. They were not able to speak to him that evening.
They came back the next day, just after midday, and they did get access to Jozef Puška on that occasion. They were speaking to him with the aid of a translator, who again was on the mobile phone, and he told them about the incident that he said happened to him in Blanchardstown. So they listened to this story, and again, they thought there were a lot of holes. Finally, they asked him, do you have a bike? And he said, yes, I do have a bike, but I haven't had that bike for about 2 weeks. It was stolen from outside my house in Mucklagh.
He was asked to describe the bicycle. He said that it was black at the back and that it was green at the front. And this certainly sounded very similar to the very distinctive bicycle that was found near Aisling Murphy's body.
And at that point, Gardaí in Tullamore had obtained a warrant to seize Jozef Puška's clothing and hospital.
So Detective Jennings returned to speak with Jozef Puška that evening. He was assisting his colleague, Sergeant Pam Nugent, from Tullamore Garda Station, and she was serving a warrant on St James's Hospital.
She and Detective Sergeant Brian Jennings then went into a private room with Mr Puška. He was wheeled into that room in his hospital bed. They described him as being awake, as being alert. He was no longer on any monitors. He didn't seem to be in any discomfort. He didn't seem to be in any pain. They explained the search warrant to him. They explained that they were taking his belongings. They took some clothing that he had in hospital with him, and they also took a blood sample from the hospital's lab.
And he asked at that point if he was a suspect in the Aisling Murphy murder investigation. He was told that he wasn't a suspect, but that he was a person of interest. It was at that point that Jozef Puška paused, and they described it as a notable pause, and they said that he was like someone who was thinking.
Mr Puška asked the interpreter to translate something word for word to the two sergeants in the hospital room. He said, "I did it, I murdered, I am the murderer." Things shifted very quickly because he was no longer a person of interest. He was now a suspect who was making a very serious confession to a very serious crime.
The sergeant said that he immediately cautioned Jozef Puška, told him that he didn't have to say anything further, but Mr Puška did go on.
Detective Hogan was sitting there, and he said that Mr Puška then started to again speak freely. As soon as he started talking, Detective Hogan said that he told him that he didn't have to speak to him, that his solicitor was on the way, that they were making arrangements, but that didn't stop Mr Puška from telling him what he felt he needed to say.
He started describing to the Garda how he had carried out the stabbing. Detective Garda told the trial that he did not ask Jozef Puška to come forward with this information, but as Anne-Marie Lawler, prosecution counsellor, would later put it, opening the trial, she said that Jozef Puška had come forward with information about how Aisling Murphy had died that at that point no one else knew, and she's described this as very significant.
So Joseph Puska remained in hospital for a further 5 days after he had made that alleged admission. So on the 18th, he was due to be discharged from the hospital, and Gardaí had decided long before that as soon as he was to be discharged, they were going to arrest him. They handcuffed him and they put him in the back of a Garda car and they drove him to Tullamore Garda station.
I was asked to go to Tullamore District Court on the day that Joseph Puska was due to be charged. Now, when I got there, he was still in Garda custody, so we didn't know at that point what stage, if he was going to appear that evening or not. We then gathered at the courthouse. There was a big media gathering there of reporters, photographers, TV crews, and we all witnessed the ugly scenes that transpired. When a person is held in custody on suspicion of murder, the law dictates that they either be released or charged by a certain time. If the DPP's instructions are that they be charged, they have to more or less appear in court almost immediately. So there was a very small window between Joseph Puska being released from his custody and appearing in court. He was in court about half an hour after the DPP instructed that he be charged. So the Guardian didn't really have enough time to put in place a crowd control operation.
A large group of people had assembled to demonstrate, I suppose, their anger about what had happened.
He was escorted in by a number of Gardaí, and he was met with a barrage of insults. People were screaming at him, people were calling him names. Gardaí had to push people back as they tried to make a route inside the front door of the courthouse.
And he was heckled as he was brought in to the hearing. It was a very brief hearing. Evidence was given of arrest charge and caution.
He was wearing a COVID face mask and stood there in the dock. There were relatives of Aisling Murphy's family were standing at the back of the court, and they were holding up photographs of Aisling, and that's a scene I've never witnessed before in any courtroom. And at that point, the enormity of what he had done and the impact it was going to have on so many people, including his own family, must have hit home to him.
It looked like a mob gathering outside at the courthouse, waiting for Joseph Puska.
People were very angry, emotions were running very high.
And there was a lot of noticeable, palpable anger there towards Mr. Puska because of what they believed he had done at that point.
And then he had to be brought back out of the courthouse and back into that Garda van.
The atmosphere in court was very tense. It certainly reflects just how sad, desperately sad this case was, how senseless Aisling's death was.
In the main body of the court were Aisling's family. They occupied 2 full benches every day. Mam Kathleen, Dad Raymond, Amy Cahill, and then of course Aisling's beloved partner Ryan Casey.
You could hear a pin drop in this packed courtroom when Joseph Puska rose to his feet in the dock and the charge was put to him and he pleaded not guilty.
If you're an accused person facing a trial, you have to expect to be doing at least 20 years if you're convicted. Obviously, if you go to fight a case and if you're successful in terms of a not guilty verdict, well then you walk away. So there's obviously a huge possible advantage to you there, and some people just might be prepared to take the risk.
The evidence in this case was so overwhelming against Joseph Puska. It was so compelling, but he still felt that in many ways, that he was in a position to fight it. That alone tells you what he actually thinks about Aisling Murphy's family and what they've been through since the beginning of this process. And it epitomises the kind of person that he is. He had zero regard for them whatsoever throughout all of this. He had no remorse, no empathy, and he thought that he could get off with murder.
Deborah, will you take us through what's been happening in court this morning?
Yes, Colette. Well, opening the trial for the prosecution a short time ago, Senior Counsel Anne-Marie Lawler said shortly after midday on January 12th last year, Josef Pushka is seen on CCTV footage aimlessly meandering through the town of Tullamore on his bicycle.
Compilation of CCTV footage that had been created out of over 25,000 hours of harvested footage was shown to the jurors.
He left home about midday on his bike, and CCTV footage picks him up at a school in Mucklagh, St Coleman's National School, and he's cycling by on his way into Tullamore town.
He cycled around a couple of different locations by the Tullamore Court Hotel. He was spotted again then cycling in very close proximity, very, very slowly, behind a woman named Beata Borowska as she was heading towards a Tesco supermarket that's out at the Tullamore retail part at the end of Church Road.
When she went into Tesco, he did a U-turn and went back towards Tullamore. Beata Borowska was totally unaware that somebody was behind her that day. There was also another woman whom Josef Pushka was seen to be following, Anne-Marie Kelly.
She was out walking her dog at 2 p.m. She became aware of a man following behind her.
Josef Pushka could be seen on this CCTV footage at the Church Road roundabout in Tullamore as Anne-Marie Kelly crosses that road with the dog heading towards the canal for her walk. Josef Pushka is seen crossing at roughly the same spot where she crossed the road and then cycling very slowly behind her.
She kind of moved in on the footpath to give him an opportunity to pass her by, but she said that he didn't pass her by, he stayed cycling right behind her. So she walked on another little bit and she decided to stop then, again leaving a gap for this person to pass, and she said at that point he did pass, but as he passed he stared straight at her.
She met Josef Pushka again that afternoon when she went to the Grand Canal to continue her exercise.
She said that the encounter had made her feel uncomfortable. She walked down to that same Dangan Road car park where Aisling Murphy would also arrive. And she said this man then was walking behind her, very closely behind her, pushing the bicycle the whole time. She stopped to tie her shoelace and to get her dog's attention, and he overtook her at that point. Because she didn't want another encounter with this man, she made a decision that she was going to start running and she was going to run by him. She would not make eye contact with him and not try to have any interaction with him whatsoever. So she arrived at Digby Bridge a few minutes after that, and that seems to have been quite a busy place. She met quite a number of people there, but in particular she met one person who stuck out in her memory. I think she said it was the last person who she saw there. And she's described this person as being very smiley, very chatty, very nice young woman. She knelt down to pet the dog and asked what breed it was. She said she just seemed like a really nice, smiley, chatty, happy young person. It would appear was one of the last sightings, actually, of Aisling before she died.
Jenna Stack and Aoife Marin were significant, crucial witnesses for the prosecution.
Both primary school teachers also, they were going out for a run on the afternoon of January 12th, 2022.
They were about halfway through their run when they saw a bike just pushed into the bushes. It wasn't thrown down, Jenna Stack said. She said someone seemed to have placed it quite deliberately in the bushes.
They thought it was unusual. It was a nice bike. They wondered why somebody had left it there. They continued on their run, but they hadn't got very far when she heard some noises coming from the hedgerow. These noises gave her some cause for concern. She was certain it wasn't an animal. She approached the hedgerow. She started shouting, "Is there somebody in there?"
She saw a man crouched over down in the ditch. At first she believed that he might have fallen off the bike and that he might have been injured.
She said that she could clearly see this person crouching over another person. She couldn't see the upper half of this person, but she could see the lower half. She could tell from what this person was wearing that it was a girl.
She described how she saw the woman who was pinned down by the man, that the woman was unable to speak. She wasn't making any sound, but it was like she was crying for help.
And her legs were kicking really hard. She said she was kicking from her core, using her body in any way she could to try and get help.
Ms. Stack said that Josef Puszka turned around to her through gritted teeth and said, "Get away." And she just described this as absolutely terrifying.
She threatened to call the guards. She hoped that that would scare the man off, that he would perhaps get off this girl and leave her alone. But it didn't work. It didn't deter the man. He actually lunged at them as if to frighten them, and at that point they ran to get help.
Jenna Stack gave a very vivid description of what she had seen that day, but it was put to her by defence counsel Michael Bowman, who was representing Mr. Puszka, that perhaps what she had seen was his client Mr. Puszka assisting Miss Murphy. That he wasn't the attacker, he wasn't the assailant, that he was trying to help her.
When all of this was put to her, she said no. She said that she could tell from the way that the girl was kicking out, from the scene that was unfolding in front of her, that this girl was in complete distress.
Earlier, the court heard Gardaí attempted CPR at the scene where the 23-year-old was found in January last year, but couldn't resuscitate the school teacher.
Aisling's body was taken from the scene to Tullamore General Hospital, where it was examined by state pathologist Dr. Sally-Ann Collis.
The results of her post-mortem were presented to the jury, and it took her almost 2 hours to deliver her findings. Such, I suppose, was the amount of injuries suffered by Aisling Murphy. Heartbreakingly, she said that Aisling may have had defensive wounds, that she had fought her attacker. She had fought Josef Puszka right up until the end.
The pathologist had taken samples from underneath Aisling's fingernails, and those samples were analysed, and they returned a DNA sample.
A number of items were removed from the crime scene to subsequently be forensically examined. A mountain bike was found close to the vicinity where Aisling's body was found.
DNA that was a match for Josef Puszka was found on the handlebars and gear mechanism of the bike, and also a fingerprint that was a perfect match for his right ring finger was found on the underside of the saddle.
It's very unusual for a defendant in a murder trial in Ireland to take the witness stand in their own defence. But that's what Josef Puszka did. He sat up in the witness box, he had his translator to his left-hand side. He was quite confident in what he was saying. His demeanour was even cocky.
And he basically was asked by his defence barrister, Michael Bowman, to take us through the day of January 12th, 2022. He told what the prosecution would later put it as a cock and bull story.
He said that he'd been cycling along the canal, minding his own business, trying to get a bit of exercise, when a person he did not know, who was wearing a COVID mask and dressed in black, started shouting at him and pushed Josef Puszka from his bike. He described the man stabbing him 3 times in the stomach. Aisling Murphy, he said, walked into this situation and she said something to this man, and Puszka described this person then turning his attentions to Aisling. According to Josef Puszka's story, this man then just ran away in the direction of the N52 and appears to have just disappeared. Puszka says that he then went over to Aisling. He tried to help her by pulling her scarf up over her injuries, but he realised he couldn't do anything for her, and so instead of trying to help her or trying to get any help for her, he climbed through those briars and those thorns and went off into a field.
He was cross-examined by Anne-Marie Lawler. She picked holes in his story all over the place. She said to him, "You're an inveterate liar." Even when he was being led by his own defence counsel, Michael Bowman, his story was farcical, it was nonsensical.
We know that the man who he claimed to have attacked him before attacking Aisling did not exist. This was a lie, so I think it's fair to say that those wounds were inflicted by himself.
This man had made a confession. He had Aisling's DNA under his fingernails. Eyewitnesses had placed him at the scene, and crucially, he was stalking at least 2 other women on the day that he killed Aisling.
It was presumably a very hurtful lie for Aisling's killer to tell in front of Aisling's family, but that was what Joseph Puska came up with months after this happened. When other witnesses were present, like Jenna Stack, like Aoife Maron, he didn't call out to them and say, "Oh, somebody's after attacking me." He didn't say that to Gardaí when he was in St. James's Hospital a couple of days later. He didn't say it to Gardaí after he'd been arrested 6 days after the murder on the 18th of January. All he ever said was that he'd never seen Aisling before, never met her before. That was the first anyone ever heard of this idea that there was this COVID-compliant killer wearing a COVID mask, dressed in black, who stabbed Aisling and also stabbed Joseph Puska and then disappeared into a puff of smoke. Whenever a verdict is coming in a murder trial, there is a very tense atmosphere, and there was a tense atmosphere in courtroom 13 in the Criminal Courts Justice Building when it became clear that the jury had returned a verdict.
By the time word filtered through the Criminal Courts of Justice that a verdict was imminent, the jury had only been deliberating for about 2 hours. It was at about 2:05 when the juryminder came into Court 13 to tell the registrar that the jury had a verdict. Aisling's family quickly filed back into the courtroom. They were in about a minute afterward, got out. Her mother, Kathleen, holding this beautiful framed photograph of Aisling, holding it tight. Joseph Puska was then brought back in from the holding cell a few minutes later. The jury foreperson was asked if they had reached an agreement. He said that they had. He then handed over the issue paper to the registrar. Time froze as the registrar opened up that issue paper to reveal the juror's decision. Guilty. A word that Aisling Murphy's family had been waiting to hear for the best part of 2 years. In fact, 666 days since Aisling Murphy was stolen from them.
There was an audible sigh of relief, I think, from the Murphy family.
Overcome by emotion, they sobbed, they embraced each other. I noticed Kathleen raising Aisling's photo a little bit higher. It danced around the public gallery.
And Mr. Justice Tony Hunt told the jurors that they had made the right decision, and he had urged them in this trial to return a verdict in accordance with the evidence. And he was said that he was glad that they didn't waste any more of their time on Joseph Puska's nonsense, as he put it.
We have evil in this room. The words of the judge who presided over Joseph Puska's trial moments after a jury found Puska guilty of murdering Aisling Murphy as she went for a run along the Grand Canal outside Tullamore in January of last year. Mr. Justice Tony Hunt also said there would be a day of reckoning for the accused.
After the verdict was given in the murder trial, Ryan Casey and Aisling's brother Cathal came out onto the steps of the Central Criminal Court, and they faced a bank of cameras, tens of journalists, and they gave a very emotional and heartfelt statement.
Aisling was subject to incomprehensible violence by a predator who is not known to her. While we do not glory in any conviction, we recognise the importance of holding accountable those who would commit such terrible atrocities. The judicial process cannot bring our darling Aisling back, nor can it heal our wounds. But we are relieved that this verdict delivers justice. It is simply imperative that this vicious monster can never harm another woman again.
Aisling was a vibrant, intelligent and highly motivated young woman who embodied so many great traits and qualities of the Irish people and its communities. Her life had a huge impact on so many of those around her, and she was the epitome of a perfect role model for every little girl to look up to and strive to be. She was not only an integral part of our family, but she was also a huge shining light in our community.
That was a very, very difficult thing for the family to do. They showed great strength and bravery by doing it. Directly behind them was row after row after row of family members and friends, all there in solidarity for the Murphy family, all there in memory of Aisling.
That was the first time in 22 months that we got to see and hear from the Murphy family. You know, Senior Counsel Anne-Marie Lawler said, jarring as it may be, the trial would not be about Aisling Murphy. The trial was about Jozef Puska. Once that verdict came in, the focus was shifted back to Aisling and to this beautiful young person who had been taken from her family, friends and her community far too soon in the most tragic of circumstances.
Mr. Justice Hunt said that he hoped that the family would give victim impact statements at Jozef Puska's sentence hearing so that he and the court and the country could get a better flavour of who Aisling Murphy was.
As Aisling's killer was jailed for life today, the young schoolteacher's boyfriend also delivered a powerful victim impact statement to the sentencing hearing, in which he turned directly to Jozef Puska and told him he'd robbed him of the chance to marry his soulmate.
Our house was alive with music every night as she played her fiddle. I miss her sweet music in our home. It breaks my heart. As a parent, you want your child to go out into this world and live a full and meaningful life, yet being acutely aware of how fragile their safety is, wanting to protect them. I couldn't protect my darling Aisling, and now she's gone forever.
Aisling's name and her legacy will be remembered far beyond the name of her killer, and I think that her short life will be celebrated beyond her death. I suppose a lot of people were also asking, well, as a society, what can we learn from Aisling's death and what can we take from this and ensure that it does not happen again to another innocent victim?
Particularly that this could have been anybody that we know. This could have been any one of our sisters, our daughters, our best friends. A lot of people kind of were seriously affected by it because it genuinely could have happened to anybody.
The reaction to Aisling's murder did kind of light a fire under the government, and they did feel, rightly so, that they needed to speed up their reactions. We were just in the middle of developing a national strategy on domestic sexual and gender-based violence, and that was finalised in the months after Aisling's death. We now have an offence about stalking, and we also have an offence in relation to non-fatal strangulation.
As of November 2023, an introduction of new laws and of tougher sentences in relation to gender-based violence and sexual violence and domestic violence. Aisling's death did really spur this country to have a conversation about violence.
This is not about one bad apple and eradicating violence in that way. This is systemic, and it comes from gender inequality. It's fueled by misogyny, and it affects women at all stages of their lives.
This needs to be a pivotal point, and violence against women needs to come to an end. However, since Aisling was murdered, 18 women have died violently, so I think Manny would also say progress has been made, but there is still a lot of work to be done.
For many, many, many months, those conversations were silenced, but thankfully as soon as the jury came back with the correct verdict, it was able to bring the focus back to Aisling Murphy.
She was a shining light in her community. Everybody knew her, and by all accounts, everybody loved her. The picture that is painted of her by her friends and family is of a really warm, open person, a person who wanted to give back, but also a serious person, a person who was serious about education, teaching them not only in the school in Durrow, but she also taught them at the weekends traditional music.
She was a very talented traditional Irish musician, very well known for playing the fiddle. She loved traditional Irish music. She also had a great love of GAA from a very young age. She was very active with her beloved club. Kilcormac Callaghy. In fact, in the wake of her death, the team wore training tops with the number 23 emblazoned on the front of the shirts. Aisling's memory will also live on, and her legacy will go on through the various funds that have been set up in her name, the scholarship that was set up at Mary Immaculate College, where she had just graduated as a primary school teacher. And of course, the family have set up a memorial fund, again to enhance and develop traditional Irish music in this country. What a lovely testament to all of the things that were special and close to Aisling Murphy. And we're talking about somebody who was just 23 years of age, so young, but had already achieved so much. She gave back. So many people take from their communities, but Aisling Murphy gave back in spades.